designing monsters are one of my favorite things to do.
It's also one of the hardest things.
It is. It's really difficult. But when you nail a monster sound, it's like, but that satisfaction lasts for, I don't know, a week at least. Until a week later when you listen to it again and you go, oh, it sounds terrible. But some of the approaches that they're taking in design with monsters this time around, they're getting greater variation, greater sizes. You'll see things with tentacles. You'll see things that of course lend themselves very differently. There are monsters in the game that don't have mouths. So and that lends an interesting problem to us.
Yeah, and it also takes away from if you have a game where you have 5 creatures and they're all organic creatures, they all have mouths, they all look like something that lives. You can only find so many variations to set them apart from each other. Having robots and things without mouths and all these other different kinds of creatures that are really separated from each other really helps us.
Yeah, with all of the robot types that we'll be seeing in Borderlands 2, it's allowed us to really open up the synthesizers that we have here, and we'll be integrating a lot more of like custom programmed synthesizer patches into the robots, and that'll be woven in with everything else. And we'll also be weaving in a lot of organic source material into that and making it sound synthetic. So for example, one of the loader, the exploding loader, his warning that he's about to go off is actually an elk that I've processed to make it sound like it's digital. So we'll get some of the mixture of that biological performance that ends up lending a feeling to a lot of the robots that there's almost something there alive, even though it's still synthetic. So it doesn't quite feel like a completely alien or robotic thing that you're fighting. A
lot of times they'll have concept shots, things like that we can see to start getting some idea. And then we'll do some concepting early on, just playing with different sounds, just finding tones that sort of fit the art. And then once the animations start coming online, we can really look at the movement and the behaviors, and because that plays as big a part as the actual art itself. Are they a heavy creature? Do they move with a lot of mass? Or are they light? Those kinds of things. But yeah, it just kind of evolves with design. But they sometimes they will give feedback on sounds that we've already done. But I think it's harder for them to actually imagine what that would sound like without hearing something as a reference.
Those can be entertaining conversations when everyone starts trying to get into sound speak.
Yes.
And everyone starts trying to make their own versions of creature noises.
Yes, because they'll actually physically make the noise.
Yeah. More like,
yeah, right. Yeah. I don't understand that.
Yeah.
If you threw a gorilla in just as a gorilla, I mean, people identify a gorilla. They know that sound. So then that pulls them out of the actual monster itself. Then they're like, oh, well, that's a gorilla, obviously.
And it's funny because actually a lot of the gorilla roars that people hear in movies are not gorillas. So and it's funny because we'll get designers or artists to be like, no, we want it to roar like a gorilla. And we're like, gorillas don't roar. They hoot. And they're like, no. I said, no, they scream. Haven't you seen, I don't know.
Gorillas in the Mist.
Yes, with all the screaming gorillas.
I don't even know if I saw that movie. I was trying to think of a movie with gorillas in it.
So that's actually kind of funny too. Is that sometimes and other times they'll come to us and they'll ask us that and be like, "You want to scream like that gorilla?" And we'll just be like, "Okay," and we'll understand that that probably was actually more like horse and pig and something like that.
With a little lion.
Because that's what they really mean. The bullymong was an interesting creature to do because he's got very definite ape type characteristics to him, and he's huge, and his paws are like enormous. So they're obviously not going to be. They're going to be making huge thumping sounds. But it was a challenge to not make everything so huge that you just couldn't pick anything out from each other. So, in order to get his roar together, most of the source that I used was horse, polar bear, and a little sea lion, and a few lion vocalizations here and there. It's probably a little difficult to... So a lot of his sounds, I wanted them to sound kind of wet, in a way, wet, gurgly. You know, get that kind of right there, where it's almost like it's coming out of his chest, and it's like, you know, it's not something that it's not like a Tyrannosaurus. You know, it's something a little more primitive than that. That makes sense. So he's got all sorts of sounds like that. Now, in his throws, there's a lot of the horse source is actually not even really pitched, especially in his deaths. There is actually a horse in there, and that's actually what the horse sounds like when they. I think the sound was labeled as terrified scream. So I always wondered what they did to get the horse to do a terrified scream.
No, I don't want to know.
But it sounds awesome. So you hear he's got that kind of nasally, that kind of, you know, the horse is making that sound because a lot of that audio is actually coming through its nasal passages. If it were that alone, it wouldn't be big enough. So I have to find other sources that will complement that. And I found a lot of that in the polar bear, where they're pushing a whole lot of air through, like, through a giant throat, basically. And on that, I have, like I said, I have an effect running to add a little bit of kind of shimmer to it, so that it doesn't sound quite so natural. So when you mix the two of them together, you get a mixture that sounds like one voice, but it has the characteristics of that, the polar bear supporting the lower frequencies and kind of the bowls of the beast, and then the horse supplying some of that character on top.
There's some libraries that have lions and tigers, and then there's other ones that are apes. And, you know, once we get them all together, at least the way that I do it is I try to imagine, or I imagine what I want the crux of that sound to be. And then when I bring those particular roars or whatever in that sound somewhat in the ballpark, then I just start constructing and saying, okay, well, what's missing from this? You know, I would like it to squeal more, so maybe a pig underneath, you know, or, you know, it needs to hiss, you know, when its mouth is open, so you bring in a cobra, you know, those kinds of things.
There's a lot of animals that have very interesting harmonics in their voice that you don't necessarily hear until you start to pitch it down. And after a while, you start to get a sense of where those harmonics are going to be. And as you're going through source, you can be like, oh, that guy, that's not the right sound. But if I pitch him down 8, I bet I would start hearing this come out. Mm-hmm. And then you'll go ahead and bring it in and start experimenting with that. I use a lot of birds. There are some birds that actually have some pretty raspy voices. And birds especially, they actually produce their bird songs almost like synthesizers in a way. There are people who've slowed bird songs down, and you can actually almost sound like sine waves. And they actually create the bird songs by having like 2 different oscillating sounds going on at the same time. So when you start to take those 2 sounds and pitch them down, you start to get these really strange harmonics out of them. You can get these really weird sounds. And when the bird, like if you find a bird that's like a crow but has a longer sustained sound and it's kind of got that raspiness to it, there's not much else that can produce that same sort of tone, and it's a very kind of chilling tone. And I forget what the name of the birds were, but there were 2 different birds that I ended up combining for the racks in the first one, in Borderlands 1.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
And when I put that audio in the game, half the team was like, oh, it wasn't really all that interesting fighting them before, but all of a sudden they started screaming right on top of me, and that like blood, it was like this blood curdling scream that they described it as. They were like, and like none of them knew they were making sound in the game anymore, so people were like. This is one of the. There we go. So. Okay, so this was one of the elements of the racks, and if you were to play a game, you might recognize some of this. But I don't remember what kind of bird this is, but when I first heard it, I was like, oh, well, if that pitched down, that would sound pretty gnarly. So, pitch down. It's got this right there. It's got all this almost prehistoric, and he had this like flutter right there in the beginning that just immediately identifiable. And when that goes off right next to your head in the game, and we set them up so they wouldn't trigger that roar until they were like right next to you.
It's going off right next to my.
Yeah. It really catches your attention. So this is a pitch down. And I would do a little more processing and EQ and stuff like that, and possibly, well, I won't get into those specific matters. Interesting. So that's pitch down, and normally, it's just annoying. Normally.